Hi, I'm Dave Watts. Welcome to the ninth part of GSA 3, Writing a Connector. In this session, we'll learn to evaluate whether we should build a connector, how to build the configuration page that the connector will display in the GSA admin console, how to build functionality to fetch and feed documents, and how to deploy your new connector. It's often useful to search content in systems other than web servers, like file systems, SharePoint, and internal applications or databases. However, many of these systems contain external metadata or protect content with user-level security, so the crawler may not work. When this is the case, you have two primary ways of searching content. You can fetch and index it at crawl time using a feed or connector, or you can send a real-time search request using a one-box module. The one-box approach is simple and may work, but will likely be slow when dealing with documents and will not rank results by relevance. A feed can fetch and index documents and metadata, but it won't provide all of the functionality of a connector. You'll be responsible for implementing the logic to traverse content, schedule reacquisition, log activity, and check user security. The other option is to build a connector. However, building a connector requires a significant amount of time and effort. The good news is, a connector provides a framework for doing all of these things. The connector framework conforms to the Spring framework for Java servlets, and it provides interfaces for configuration, traversal, and security. Before we show you how to create a connector, let's see what the final product will look like to an administrator. To deploy your connector within the appliance, an administrator will have to point the GSA to your connector manager. The connector manager will provide a list to the GSA of the connectors it includes. When the administrator chooses and adds a connector, the connector manager fetches a configuration form from your connector. You will need to implement the interface that builds this form. The area in the slide highlighted in green shows the custom fields of this form. The standards fields used by all connectors are automatically presented as part of the form by the connector base classes. To generate this form and process the data sent from the form, you'll need to implement three methods within your custom connector type. The getConfigForm method is used to build the initial empty HTML form. The validateConfig method receives the form data and sets the appropriate values within the connector. The getPopulateConfigForm method retrieves previously saved connector values and rebuilds a completed HTML form when an administrator needs to reconfigure the connector. You will need to implement the accessor and mutator functions, getters and setters, to read and write configuration data. The GSA interacts with the connector manager, and the connector manager communicates with the connector. The connector manager invokes and initializes the connector, causes the connector to fetch batches of documents, and schedules the submission of feeds to the GSA. Within your connector, you will be responsible for implementing the custom APIs of your target document repository. You may optionally build a cache of stored documents to provide to the connector manager for subsequent document batches. Your connector will define local variables as well as the get and set methods to manipulate them. It will also implement the login method. This method instantiates a session, which in turn creates a traversal manager, an authentication manager, and an authorization manager. The login method then returns the session object. The connector manager will then be able to invoke methods of these objects through the session object. Most of the code you use for this will be boilerplate, and you will simply have to fill in a few blanks. The authentication manager and authorization manager each have one method. Most of your work will be within the Traversal Manager and within the document list class returned by Traversal Manager. The Traversal Manager starts the traversal by creating a document list. It also specifies the number of documents to retrieve within a single batch using the batch hint variable, and keeps track of the connector's position within the list of documents in the repository using the checkpoint parameter. It'll run continuously until the connector is reset. The document list is created by the Traversal Manager. It's responsible for fetching each document into a batch and setting a checkpoint when the batch has been created or when the fetch process is interrupted. This checkpoint will be used for the next traversal when the resume traversal method is called. The traverse method is where a lot of the work happens. This method creates an empty list of documents based on the batch size and interacts with your content repository to fetch documents. Then, for each document, it creates a hash map of document properties, creates a simple document object for each document within the document list, and finally, returns the list. Once the traverse method returns the document list, the next document and checkpoint methods of the document list can be invoked by the connector manager. The next document method iterates through the documents within the list. The checkpoint method keeps track of the location of the last document processed. For this to work, you need to be able to sort all of the documents within the repository, not just the ones within the current list. You might use a single unique attribute or a single combination of document attributes for all documents within the repository. As the connector manager iterates through the document list, it will retrieve each document property and its corresponding value. If the document list returns null, the connector manager will wait for a short period, then call the resume traversal method. By default, this short period is 5 minutes, but it can be changed using the retry delay field in the configuration form. If the document list returns an empty set, this indicates that traversing the content repository hasn't completed, and the connector manager will immediately call the resume traversal method. To deploy your connector, you'll need to build the jar file containing your connector, then deploy it within a connector manager J2EE web application in Tomcat. The connector manager is itself packaged as a WAR file and will need to be deployed within the Tomcat web apps directory. The connector manager will automatically expand and deploy when you restart Tomcat. By default, Tomcat listens on TCP port 8080. Then, you can configure the connector manager within the GSA. Once you've done this, your connector will be available from the drop-down list for that connector manager within the GSA admin console. During the development cycle, you'll need to rebuild and redeploy your connector. To do this, the easiest way is to just delete the connector manager from within Tomcat and repeat the initial deployment process. If you simply want to restart a traversal, delete the state file and restart Tomcat. This unit covers the basic functionality of the connector framework, but to build a connector, you'll have to consider how to fetch or receive updates from your content repository. There are 3 approaches. One is to build a listener within your connector so that the content repository can notify the connector of updates. This is probably the most complex approach in most cases, and requires your content repository have the ability to send notifications, but it will generally provide the best performance. Another approach is to fetch only new and changed documents since the last traversal. This requires a way to identify only new and changed documents, of course. Finally, you can simply fetch all documents during every traversal. This approach may be the easiest to implement, but will generally have the poorest performance. If you want to honor the crawl schedule settings defined by an administrator in the connector configuration page, then you'll fetch documents during calls of the start traversal and resume traversal methods. If you want to fetch documents asynchronously from your content system and then feed them to the GSA according to the crawl schedule defined by the administrator, then you fetch documents outside of the start traversal and resume traversal methods. Some of the connectors provided by Google fetch documents during calls of these methods, such as the Documentum and LiveLink connectors. Others, like the SharePoint and file system connectors, do not. Let's take a look at the process of building a connector. First, we'll start by finding the information that we need in the documentation and finding the downloads that we need. So if I visit the Google Search Appliance product documentation page, on the right side I have a link to connector documentation. And from that page, I have a link to the Connector Developer's Guide. The current latest version listed here is actually 2.4. So I'll go ahead and click on that. And this online book basically steps us through the process of building a connector using the starting connector manager, the empty connector manager that they give us, as well as some sample Java classes. Now, to actually get the files that I need, I'll need to visit the Google Enterprise Connector Manager open source site on code.google.com. From here, if I go to the Downloads tab, it'll give me a couple of different places to go. The Enterprise Support Portal is where I want to go to get pre-built installers for supported versions of the connector. We can also get those from the installers folder listed here on Google Drive. But what we really want is the connector manager without any connectors. So that's this link right here, Google Search Appliance Connectors folder. And if I go ahead and click on that and go into the connectors folder and go to Connector Manager, I can download the latest version, which here is Connector Manager 3.2.6. Now, to build your connector, you're going to need a Java development kit, you're going to need Apache Tomcat, and you're going to need some text editor to edit your Java source code. We use Eclipse typically and recommend that. So you'll need to download all three of these components. Tomcat is the servlet engine that's used as a container for your connector manager. Now, we have a machine that's pre-configured with Eclipse and Apache and of JDK, of course. And we've downloaded the connector manager onto that machine. And we can see it's a WAR file. WAR stands for Web Archive. And it's basically just a zip file that contains a bunch of libraries. We're going to need to take that and deploy it on Tomcat and make sure that it works and expands. So before I do anything, I'm just going to make sure that Tomcat runs properly. I've navigated to the bin subdirectory of Tomcat, and I'll run the startup command. Startup command will spawn another command prompt, and there's not much there to show me other than the fact that it did start up successfully, because there are no web apps installed on here yet. I'll shut it down. And now I'm ready to deploy the connector manager itself. So I'm going to take the connector manager and I'm going to place the WAR file in the web apps subdirectory. So I'll just copy that and paste it. I'll start up Tomcat again. And this time I'll get a little bit more information, because I'll get some information about my empty connector manager, but nothing really interesting yet. I'll go ahead and shut it down again. And now in my web apps directory, you'll notice I have a connector manager subdirectory. So this is the exploded connector manager. This is the running web app. And later on, if I need to make changes, I can simply delete this directory, stop and restart Tomcat, and it'll redeploy the WAR, and I can place my custom code in the connector manager directory. Now, I've already set up the project in Eclipse called Hello World Connector, and from the tutorial site, provides code for 4 files: hello world connector.java, hello world connector type.java, which are in this com.example.connector namespace, and 2 configuration files, connector instance and connector type. And if I simply copy and paste the appropriate code into these 4 files, which again I got from the tutorial site. If I go ahead and save that, I can simply compile it by choosing Export, building a jar file, making sure that my source and library folders are selected, and clicking Finish. One other thing to note, I have a library that is extracted from the connector manager called connectorspi.jar, and I made sure it's registered with my project so it shows up here as well. So when you download connectormanager.war, you'll extract this from the webinf lib directory and simply register it in your project. So with Tomcat off, I can go in my connector manager directory into webinf and into lib, and I can take my new Hello World connector and copy that into that directory, and then restart Tomcat once again. Now you'll notice if you look at the output, we have a new line here that tells us that we have a specific connector deployed. So the connector is automatically going to deploy just by us putting it in the right place. And again, the development cycle is typically going to involve us deleting the connector manager directory, redeploying our custom jar file, and restarting Tomcat. Now with Tomcat running, I'm ready to connect the GSA to my connector manager. But before I do that, I can use the little test connectivity applet that's bundled with the connector manager to make sure that the connector manager is responding, and that should return a simple XML response like we see here on the screen. So assuming that I can get to that, I should be able to register my new connector manager. When you install the connector managers that come with the SharePoint connector or the file system connector, etc., they register themselves because the setup.exe program basically has that functionality built in. But when we're working with just the bare metal connector manager like we are here, we're going to have to manually register it ourselves. So I'll go ahead and register mine, and I'll simply provide the name and the service URL here, and then click on Save. After a few seconds, I should get back a message saying new connector manager successfully added, and I can see a green light next to it. It will take a few seconds, so make sure you're patient with that. And I can see back in Tomcat some of the connection information that's happened. So I can see I've got a message from my GSA. Now let me jump back into Eclipse for a second. So the default out-of-the-box Hello World connector basically just makes up a bunch of documents. So if I scroll down in Hello World Connector.java and take a look at the document list class, you'll notice that basically what it's doing is building a bunch of documents with fake URLs and which have some very simple content. They have the string Hello World. And that's really it. So we don't need an actual repository here for this Hello World connector to work. In real life, of course, we would have to populate these with actual document properties that we were getting from the API of the system that had our content. So that part, of course, is not in our connector. So with that in mind, let me go back to my GSA and go to Connectors. And I'll add a new connector to Hello World Manager. And there's only one type, of course, so the GSA is able to talk to the connector manager. The connector manager can advertise the available connectors. So I'll go ahead and create a new connector instance, which I will just call Hello World Connector. And click on Get Configuration Form. So clicking on that is going to have the connector manager call the Get Config Form method of our connector. And that doesn't really have a lot of information in it. So we don't have any advanced properties. We have all of the standard stuff that we normally see. That's handled for us automatically by the connector manager. We have a little bit here, fake form with an individual field. If I go back to Hello World Connector type, we can see that that string of HTML comes right from the class definition. And there's nothing else really happening here. It's just kind of some empty placeholders. And you'll notice that we actually have to embed the HTML to build the form fields themselves. So it's going to take that literal string and incorporate that into a larger HTML form. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and save this without making any changes because there really aren't any changes to make. And I can see that my Hello World connector shows up, and it's of type Hello World connector. It's not providing a version number. We would be responsible for providing that if we wanted to. If I go to the feeds page, and scroll down, I can see that I have a Hello World connector instance there, and I can see that it failed in error. I need to add the Google connector pattern to my start and block URLs. I'll go back to my connectors and reset the connector. Then I'll go back to my feeds. And I can see now that I have two feeds in progress. The first one sent 500 documents. The second one sent 495 documents. And again, those documents are all just made up. After a short period, I should be able to reload the list of feeds and see that my feeds have completed. And I can go back and take a look at index diagnostics, and I should be able to see my documents listed there. So there are my 1,000 documents, all very similar. Now I'm ready to run a search. These documents are public because we don't have any security involved. So I'll simply search for the word hello. And of course, I find one document and the rest are hidden because they're very, very similar in URL pattern and content. So if I click through my filter, I can see all of these different documents. Back in Tomcat, I can see that some interesting things have happened. I can see my traversal restart, and I can see the information sent from different clients. So all that information is showing up here. So far, we're working with the stock out-of-the-box Hello World connector. Let's go ahead and add some new functionality to it. First, we'll collect a username and password which could presumably be used for crawling if we needed to pass those credentials to the API that the connector is going to interact with. So you'll remember in Hello World connector type, we have a string of HTML. I'm going to replace that with a longer string of HTML. Now, at a certain point, this becomes unwieldy, but we're embedding HTML here to capture the username and password. And basically, we're building multiple rows. So there's a larger table that will automatically be rendered. So we build rows and individual cells within that. Now, to actually use those values somewhere, I'll go to Hello World connector and go to the constructor. And right at the top of the constructor, I'm going to create a variable. And then I'll create two methods to let me manipulate that variable, to set it and get it. And while we're there, I'll simply output to standard out just a little bit of information so that I can see that happen. And you'll notice I get code completion there, of course, because I've specified that as a property of Hello World connector. Remember, Java is case sensitive, so be careful. I want to do the same thing with password. Rather than typing that out manually, I'm going to copy and paste a block of code I've written earlier. So now I have two properties and two setters and getters. While I'm here, I'll jump into the traverse method. And just to demonstrate that the traverse method is able to read this value properly, inside there, I'll go ahead and place a simple print statement. In Hello World Connector type, I'll change the validation so that it actually checks for the existence of username and password. And to do that, I've got a big block of code that I'm going to use, so I will simply copy and paste that code. Right now I have return null. So I'll set a variable called error message and then verify that username and password are provided. And we've got hard-coded values for the acceptable username and password. So we'll show an error message if those values aren't provided. I'm going to make one more change. I'm going to inject some fake metadata into my documents. So underneath my existing properties put statements, I'll add two more properties, author and title, and they'll simply have the same values. All the documents will have the same value, just like they all have the same content. Now with those changes made, I'll go ahead and rebuild my connector jar file. And I'll need to go ahead and stop and start Tomcat to make some changes. So I'll go to Tomcat to the command prompt here and run shutdown. Then I'll go to my Tomcat's web apps directory. I'll delete the connector manager. I'll restart Tomcat, which will re-expand the connector manager. Stop Tomcat again. And now I'll take my new Hello World connector and drop that into my new connector manager folder, right where I had it before. Start Tomcat one more time. Back on my GSA, I'll unregister the Hello World Manager. Once it's unregistered, I'll re-register it. Once it's been re-added, I'll go to Connectors. And I'll call this instance Hello World Connector 2 just for fun. You'll notice now we have username and password fields. I'll go ahead and enter the correct values for that and click on Save. And I see Hello World Connector 2 is in progress. Next, I'll add some metadata and run the feed instance a third time. To do this, I'll need to go back to my Hello World connector and paste in 2 lines. Here I'm just going to insert 2 values, an author and a title. They'll be the values for every document. Obviously, in real life, we would want to get these from our API. Now, with that built, I'll once again go up here and export. Export my Hello World connector to the same location as before. Now on Tomcat, I'll need to stop and start Tomcat one more time. I'll shut down Tomcat. Delete the entire exploded connector manager. Restart Tomcat to let the connector manager reinstall. Navigate to the live directory of the connector manager and drop in the new version of Hello World Connector. Shut it down one more time. Start it up one more time. And at this point, again, I should see messages about our new connector type, Hello World Connector. So now I'm ready to go back to GSA2. And I'll go to Hello World Manager. You'll notice it's already re-registered itself, which is kind of nice. If I wasn't sure that was going to work out, again, what I could do is simply unregister it. Then register it again. I'll give it the same name. Once it's there, I can add the new connector instance again. This one I'll call Hello World Connector 3. It has the username and password fields from before. And it should immediately start building feeds and sending them. I can verify that by going to the feeds list. I'll have to wait a little while until they show up in crawl diagnostics, but once they do, I can take a look at their metadata. After refreshing the screen a few times, I can see that Hello World connector has completed its feeds. And after waiting a few minutes, it's probably under index diagnostics as well. So here under index diagnostics, I can see Hello World connector 3. And if I drill down into those, just drill down into any document, they all have the same values. I can now see my metadata. And if I were to do a search of GSA2, I can see that I'll get all of those results generated. I'm not showing the metadata in my style sheet, but I'm able to filter by it. So that shows two of the things you might do with connectors right off the bat. Again, kind of showing how they work a little bit. Just to go back into Tomcat. Remember, you're going to have a connector and connector type class. You're also going to have configuration files. The configuration files don't typically need that much in them. Simply pointing to the beans of the appropriate connector and type. The connector class itself is going to contain a constructor that creates a session and that handles any values that you need to set and get. Your traversal manager is going to create a document list and use start and resume traversal with it, keeping track of the location with the checkpoint. And then your traverse method is where the work really happens. The connector is going to talk to your API or talk to a local data store it's already built up from your API, and then populate each record as appropriate from those values, returning a document list. So the functionality in a connector follows the structure of the framework provided. So the connector API is not necessarily like a traditional API where you can simply call one method to do one thing. You have to call all of the methods in the right sequence, and all those methods are related together in related classes, basically. So you'll have to use the framework as it is, and basically follow this model that we've shown in class. Again, though, most of the complexity is going to happen in the areas of actually interacting with your API, bringing back the data from your API, figuring out how you want to store that data. You could, again, for example, go out and fetch a lot of data from your API, store it in some sort of local data store, and let the connector read from that. So many different choices there. But again, you will need to follow this framework, which, again, in my mind, is a little different than conforming to a traditional API where you can simply call a method, get an expected result, and then call whatever other method you want. Here, again, you basically have to
use the class implementations that you build, and they have to contain certain methods. They have to conform to the interface that's specified. This concludes our 9th presentation, Writing a Connector. Thank you for watching, and make sure to watch the other GSA 3 presentations.